In this video, I'm going to go over the 3 problems I recommended to you as practice for using truth tables to assess the validity of arguments. 2 of them are 8-column truth tables, which you just need to get comfortable using, at least until we give you the shortcut method, which I promise is coming soon. So for the first one, I've just laid out our premises and conclusion in a truth table format, and I've already filled out the values for all the possible truth value combinations. So we're just going to get right into filling it out for the actual premises and conclusion. For the first one, we have 3 premises. If A, then H and J. A, if and only if J, and not J. And the conclusion that we're looking at is not A. So let's start with this first premise by filling out the antecedent and the consequent. So the first one, the antecedent, is just A. So we're just going to copy down the truth values from the A column, that first column, which is just 4 trues and 4 falses. So next, let's look at the consequent, which is H and J. So, and on any row that H and J are both true, we're going to put true, and on every other row, we're going to put false. And now we're going to look at that conditional. So the conditional says, remember, a conditional is only false when the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. So on this first row, it is true. Second row, it's false. Third and fourth rows, it's also false because we have the true antecedent of A and the false consequent of that H and J. The second 4 rows, we have a false antecedent. So we know it's going to be true the rest of the way down, because as long as we have a false antecedent, we know that we've got a true conditional. So now we've got A, if and only if J. So this is going to be true when the truth values of A and J match. So in the first column, they're both true. They don't match on the second row. A is true and J is false. Both true on the third row. The fourth is the same as the second. And then here, A is false and J is true, so it's false. They're both false here, so it's true. A is false and J is true, so it's false on the 7th row. And on the last row, they're both false, so it's true there again. Our last premise is the negation of J. So we're just going to take those J truth values, alternating true then false, and flip them. So we're going to alternate false then true. So now we've got the truth values of all 3 of our premises, and now we're going to look at the truth value of that conclusion, which in this case is the negation of A. So we're just going to flip those truth values. So 4 falses and then 4 trues. And then, like I already showed you, what we're looking for now to actually do the validity assessment is any column on which all of the premises are true. So we see we've got one down here in the 8th column. We've got all 3 premises, which are italicized, as true. And the conclusion is also true, so that's not a counterexample to show it as invalid. On the 5th row or 6th row, we've also got all true premises, but we've also got a true conclusion, so that's not a counterexample either. And then going up from there, it looks like at least one of our premises is false on every other row. On row 1, not J is false. On row 2, A if and only if J is false. On row 3, more than one of them is false. So it looks like this is a valid argument. We don't have any row on which we have all true premises and a false conclusion. The only rows, the 6th and 8th row, on which all 3 premises are true, the conclusion is also true. So we know that this argument is a valid argument. Let's move on to the next one. Here we have 2 premises, which are if C then D, then if D then E. The second premise is D, and the conclusion is if C then E. For these, since all of the conditionals that we have involved, the lining up of the antecedents and conclusions in our in our truth value assignments are in the right order. We don't have any where we have the conclusion or the consequent before the antecedent. We're just going to go ahead and fill those out. So again, remember, for the millionth and one time, a conditional is only false when you have a true antecedent and a false consequent. So let's start filling these in for if C, then D. They're both true, so it's true. On the third row, we have a true antecedent and a false conclusion, so it's false there. Same thing on the fourth row. And on all the other rows, on the last four rows, we have a false antecedent, so we know that that conditional is going to be true. Now let's do that consequent, which is also a conditional, if D, then E. They're both true, so it's true. Here we have a true antecedent and a false consequent, so it's false. The next two rows, that antecedent is false, so we know it's going to be true. Here they're both true. Here we've got a true consequent and a true antecedent, a true antecedent and a false consequent, so it's false. And then on the last two rows, D, our antecedent, is false, so we know we've got a true conditional there. So now we can come back to the middle and do the main connective of this premise, which is also a conditional, and see what its truth value is on each row. So here they're both true, so it's true. Here we've got a true antecedent and a false consequent, so it's false. The next two rows, that antecedent is false, so we know the conditional is true. Here we've got both a true antecedent and a true consequent. On the sixth row, again, we've got a true antecedent and a false consequent, so it's false. And on the last two rows, they're both true, so it's true. So now we've got the truth values of that first premise. Our second premise is just D, which is really easy to fill in. We're just going to copy the truth values of D from that second column. So true, true, false, false, true, true, false, false. And now we're going to do our conclusion, where we're looking at if C, then E. So we're looking at that first and third column assigning truth values. Here they're both true, so it's true. We have a true antecedent and a false consequent, so it's false. Here it's true, false, and then for the last four columns, again, we have a false antecedent, so we know it's going to be true. So now let's look for rows on which we have all true premises. We have one here on the first row, but we also have a true conclusion, so it is that's not a counterexample to it being a valid argument. Then the only other row that we have both true premises is right here on the fifth row, and here we also have a true conclusion. So we know that this argument is also a valid argument because we don't have any row on which we have all true premises and a false conclusion. So let's go down to this last one. We've got two premises. One is if it's not the case that it's not the case that F, then it's not the case that it's not the case that G. And then our other premise is if it's not the case that G, then it's not the case that F. And our conclusion is if G, then F. So let's start filling in our first premise. We're going to start by filling in these negations. So first, we're just negating F, so we're flipping that truth value from true, true, false, false to false, false, true, true. And then we're going to flip it again with the negation of not F. So true, true, false, false. Then we're going to do the same thing with G, so false, true, true. And then we're going to flip those again, so back to the original truth value of G, true, false, true, false. So now we can fill this in, right? If it's not the case that it's not the case that F, then it's not the case that it's not the case that G. We're looking at this column and this column. So true, false, that's the row in which our antecedent is true and our consequence false. And then we have false antecedents for the last two columns, so the conditional is true. So now let's look at our other premise. So if it's not the case that G, then it's not the case that F. Here we're going to flip F, or flip the truth value of G, so false, true, and then flip the truth value of F, so false, false, true, true. And then we're going to fill in this center column for the truth value of that second premise. And it's only false here on the second row where we have a true antecedent and a false consequent. So now we have our conclusion, if G, then F. The reason I'm going to fill these in is because sometimes it's hard when you have your antecedent after your consequent to keep those straight when you're doing it. So we're just going to repeat those truth values from the first two columns. And then fill in the truth values of our conclusion. So true, true, false, true. So now we're looking for rows on which we have true premises. So the first row we have true premises. You can see them italicized there. We also have a true conclusion. On the third row, we have true premises, but we have a false conclusion. So this row tells us that this argument is invalid. It is possible, as we can see right here on the third row, to have both of our premises as true and our conclusion as false. We don't have to look at anything else in the table. We would highlight this and say that we've got true premises and a false conclusion. So we know that this argument is invalid. And I would recommend circling or highlighting these when you do your own work that you turn in for homeworks or exams, to show that you know why it's invalid. So this is the only one out of the practice problems that shows that we have an invalid argument. The other two arguments we had were valid. We couldn't find an example on a row like this to show that it's possible to have true premises and a false conclusion. Once you're done working through these, we're going to move on from truth tables, and we're going to show you something called the shortcut method that will make doing these a lot easier. You won't have to worry about doing these 8-column truth tables anymore if you get really comfortable with the shortcut method.